Hey Hans, it's great to see you here in London. Always fun to reconnect with a fellow West Point classmate and fellow math major.
Yeah, well, thanks, Tom, and I'm glad we can do this. And you're always very good when you're in London. You always drop me a note. So, yeah, we're doing something a bit different this time, but it's very welcome.
Yeah, well, you've had a very interesting career. You've been at RAND for over 20 years. RAND's a global think tank working with governments and NGOs. And you've been president of RAND Europe for the last 12 years. Before we dive into that, let's go back to when you were first captain at West Point. You were leading 4,000 cadets in the Corps. What do you remember were the biggest leadership lessons that you learned that helped you in your career after that?
Thanks. I mean, really good question. And I think it's hard to narrow it down to just one or two because I think, West Point teaches you so many different things. And I think the good fortune I had to be the first captain for our class meant that I probably had a very unique view of kind of how the Corps cadets operated. And I think for me, it was understanding that there were lots of different leadership styles and lots of different operations that went into making West Point a success. And there was no kind of one person that would get credit, nor was there kind of one person that should get the blame when things went wrong. And so I think that kind of team ethos and ethic really stayed with me. I think the other thing that stayed with me is that leadership is hard work. It's a lot of fun as well. Don't get me wrong. You can't run an organization and lead an organization for many years without enjoying it. But you have to be willing to put in the work. And sometimes things go well and other times they don't. And when they don't, you pick yourself up and dust yourself off and you learn from it.
How did you find your leadership ability, your leadership style? How did you develop that? And what was your leadership style?
So I think some of it's just instinctual, right? I think you kind of try things out and you see what works. But I think also you learn from others. And for me, it was learning from some of the senior officers that were at West Point while we were there. So General Howard Graves, who was the superintendent, Freddie McFerrin, who was the commandant of cadets.
Those are great role models.
Great role models. I think for me, the other officer that I really took a lot from was Frank Giordano, who was the head of the math department when we were both there and was acting dean for a year. So I think, watching how they operated and both the commitment but also the humility in which they did their jobs was something wonderful. I think you also see and learn a lot from your other fellow cadets. And there's lots of people that I could point to that taught me little things as I went through that I try to apply these days.
So let's talk about your career after West Point in the military. You've been leading RAND Europe for 12 years. What would you say, and you've been there 22 years, you've had a very different career. I had a point where I had 20 jobs in 20 years, so I got really good at networking and interviewing. And you've been at the same place for 22 years. What's motivated you over those 22 years to grow and excel in your role?
Yeah, so you did kind of 20 jobs with 20 different organizations. It feels like I've done 20 jobs with the same organization. Now, it is a little bit different. I accept that. I think for me, it was learning, taking advantage of opportunities when they would come along, grabbing them, taking what I could from them, doing my best. I think in terms of executive leadership, I had some good role models. Again, that's really helpful. But I also had the chance to do a couple of the jobs I've had at RAND in acting roles as well. So I kind of got to try them out. I got to see what works, what didn't work. So when I effectively became the president of RAND Europe, as you say, 12 years ago, I had a sense of what the job would be like. I would say that it was an imperfect sense, and I learned a lot and I made a lot of mistakes, and these things happen. But I think the opportunity to get exposed to different aspects of the role has really been helpful for me. The other thing I would say about being in my role and what's kept me there, yes, it's been the job I've been doing and the change and the challenge, but I think it's also been, I found things outside of my paid employment to keep me busy and keep me learning. So in addition to being the chief exec at RAND Europe, I also chair a governmental advisory arm's length body for the Ministry of Defense that does a lot of work with veterans. Before that, I was also involved in another veterans organization that funded research into the transition journey, moving from the armed forces into the civilian world. And I think without doing those two jobs, because they're very different, they're non-executive roles. I was the chair, but I wasn't the executive. I probably wouldn't have stayed or be in my current job as I was, because they've given me a different chance and way to learn.
When I look at you on paper, graduated first captain at West Point, 2 master's degrees from Oxford, the great position you have at Rand. Obviously, there's been some challenges you've had along the way. Let's talk about that. What has been your challenges over those last 20 plus years at Rand?
Life has its seasons, right?
Yeah.
So you kind of go up and down. I think for me, there were some really significant challenges when I became the president of Rand Europe, because we were a business that was doing well, we were having impact, but we were also growing a lot. And when we were growing, we weren't really ready to take that next step. And I think it became difficult. We had a couple of years where it was really challenging, because you're working in that transition going from maybe 60 to 80 to 100 people. And you've got to change systems, and you can't do everything on your own, and you need to bring process in, and researchers don't like process. And I'm not always sure I like process, but I recognize its value. So I think for me, it was really having to learn some of those challenging lessons of growth, transformation, and when things were tough, believing in oneself, in one's team, that actually we're going to get through and we're going to do this. And if we don't, okay, we'll all have to go out and try something else. But we're going to give it a good try, and we're going to be in the arena doing it. We're not going to be sitting on the sidelines commentating on it.
So what would be like maybe one thing that over your past 2 decades of career you would have maybe done a little bit differently?
I would have tried to get an external coach a bit earlier. I think my natural inclination is to kind of come back into myself to think about things, and having someone to bounce things off of or in an earlier stage in my career would have been helpful. Probably doing something similar with my team, certainly some members of my team. I think the other thing I probably would have done differently, didn't do as well as early in my career, was sometimes you put people in roles and it doesn't quite work. And you keep waiting for it to work, and you keep waiting it for work. And maybe that's good, right?
Yeah.
That you trust in people and give people a chance. But there's also, I think now, it's recognizing when things don't work and recognizing that you've got to make a change. And it's not necessarily anybody's fault. It's just the way the situation unfolds and presents itself.
Yeah, I've always heard the term hire slow, fire fast, but it's much harder to put into practice. I know that.
Well, it's hard to put into practice. And I think if you have a leadership philosophy like I do, which is you really trust people and you give them responsibility and you let them go, then you have to let that run and you have to let that flow. And I think the tension, but the trick is, how do you then manage that appropriately? How do you know when someone's kind of done everything that they're able to do, and then try something else?
Now let's take this in a different direction. If you were talking to a group of academy grads who were early on or maybe mid-career in their civilian careers, what advice would you have for them to grow in their careers based on your experience?
I suppose it's hard to be prescriptive there, because everyone is so different. And I think we've all learned that lesson very early, that different people have different strengths and different passions. And so I think with some people, I would say, really explore what your passions are, lean into your strengths, and then go out and try things. And don't feel like you should be restrained by, well, you're a junior military officer leaving, and therefore the career trajectory is you need to do X or you need to do Y. If you have a passion for something else, try it. If it doesn't work, you've got plenty of time to figure something else out. Sometimes it's because people don't really understand what they're interested in. I mean, the military, it gives you a very structured environment. It's a very relatively uniform career path, at least early in your career. So I think giving people the opportunity to explore what are you interested in? How is this going to work? Let me try this. Particularly things where you need to be willing to take risks, exercise some creativity. I think people that go and become entrepreneurs coming out of the armed forces, I have huge amounts of respect for, you included, by the way, because, it is just something that I would find really, really difficult, but I think, thank goodness we have people like you and others. We have other classmates that have, really done well in that space too. And it's really nice to see people able to, chase their passions and their dreams and make them work, eventually, whatever that is.
What are some of the biggest mistakes that people can make that they can avoid?
So I think if I think about people leaving, service academy graduates leaving the armed forces, going and transitioning to their civilian career, I think a lot of times they don't understand how different it is and how hard it is for civilian organizations, particularly private sector, commercial organizations, to understand what they've done in the armed forces. I think there's kind of sometimes an expectation that I've been a company commander, I've commanded a battalion, I've done all these wonderful and big things, and I'm going to go in and do the same thing in the civilian world. And that rarely happens. It does happen occasionally. We'll come back to maybe why that is. But I think there are a lot of things to learn. And I think sometimes if you don't know what you don't know, those are the things that often trip you up. How do you avoid that? And you mentioned it earlier. I think it's lean into your networks, because your networks, particularly people that were in the armed forces and then have gotten out, they've been through this journey. They've learned a lot of those lessons. You don't need to relearn those. They can help you. But also, they understand your skills. They understand that you're a good leader. They understand that you're focused on delivery. They understand that you really care about a life of service. And of course, then, particularly if they're in positions to hire you, these are exactly the sort of skills that the civilian world is crying out for. We have networks that we don't even realize that we've got.
If you had to look at what mindset or habit has helped you the most in terms of your career, what would you say that would be?
I think it's probably some combination of communication, planning, and just resilience. And so I think these are all things that we learn it.
If you were sitting before a group of 500 academy grads and giving them Hans's best piece of advice for their career, what would that be?
I think we probably touched on it a couple times in this discussion. I think it's about your career needs to be what you want it to be. Lean into your strengths. Use all of the tools at your disposal to make that happen. And make it a team event. Just don't make it you for you. But why are you passionate about these things, and how do you tap into them?
Thanks for taking the time to come out to this podcast studio and do this interview with me.
Wonderful. When you're next in town, let me know, and we'll share a beverage of choice together.
All right. Thanks again, Hans.
Great. Thank you.